Chapter 4. Mr. Abercrombie's cry stoked the shoppers and shopkeepers into action. One woman screamed, another pulled her small child to her hip, and doors shut firmly. 3 men, however, charged toward us. One, a butcher going by his bloodied apron, held a knife. "I'm not a thief!" I shouted desperately, trying to pull myself free of Mr. Abercrombie's grip. His lip curled into a sneer, and Mr. Glass punched that sneer off his face. The watchmaker's fingers sprang apart, letting me go. He stumbled to the side with a groan of agony, clutching his jaw. Before I could gather my wits and my skirts, Mr. Glass snatched my hand and hauled me away in a sprint. His other hand pressed inside his coat, over his inside pocket. "Stop, thief!" someone behind us bellowed. I didn't dare glance over my shoulder. It was difficult enough keeping up with Mr. Glass's pace as he dodged around those attempting to stop us and other obstacles in our path. The voices behind didn't grow further away, however, no matter how fast we ran. And I couldn't run any faster. My blasted corset made it impossible to take a deep breath. My chest ached with the need for air. My face felt like it would explode from heat and my throat constricted. I didn't dare ask him to slow down, however. If I were caught, I would go to prison for God knew how long. London's prisons were little better than lice-infested, disease-soaked hells. The pedestrians and obstacles thinned as we left the shopping precinct. We found ourselves in a narrow street filled with stables behind Mayfair's grand houses. Coachmen driving empty coaches glanced down at the men still chasing us, but didn't stop to help. A stable boy stepped into the street ahead and raised his fists. Mr. Glass could have easily pushed the scrappy lad aside, but he darted left under an archway, straight into a yard with no other exits. He swore in a strong American accent and called London more confusing than a honeycomb designed by drunken bees. I would have admonished him for his foul language if I had the breath. As it was, I had to fight for every one. My vision turned black at the edges too, and I had to grip his hand tightly to remain steady. Part of me was relieved to stop, yet I knew it meant the end. We were trapped. The butcher and 2 others stood beneath the arch, grinning like foxes. "Got you now," the butcher snarled. With his bloodied apron and monstrous knife in hand, he looked as if he were preparing to carve us into bite-sized pieces. "Turn around now, and no one need get hurt," Mr. Glass said in that low, commanding voice he'd used on Abercrombie. It hadn't worked then, and it didn't work now. The butcher and his colleagues approached at a steady pace. I backed up against a brick wall, Mr. Glass at my side. "Can you run?" he murmured. My breath had not yet returned, and little stars danced before my eyes. But I nodded. I had to run. There were no other choices. "I'll distract them while you slip away," he said. "Skirt around the edge to the archway. Turn left and then right. Wait for me there." I squeezed his hand, hoping he would understand that I wanted to ask him how he planned on meeting me with 3 men in the way. But he didn't understand the squeeze, and only pushed me aside to safety. The butcher and one of his friends closed the distance on Mr. Glass. The 3rd man prowled toward me. Sweat dampened his face and hair, and he breathed heavily. The look in his eyes wasn't one I'd ever seen before. They were glassy, glazed, the pupils taking over most of the whites. He seemed unaware of the fight breaking out near him and completely focused on me. There was no point trying to tell him there'd been a mistake. I couldn't reason with someone in the grip of a feverish madness. I stumbled backward, but somehow maintained my balance. With arms out at his sides, he licked his lips and advanced on me. I could try to go around, as Mr. Glass had suggested, but I wouldn't be fast enough. I had to engage him and somehow get the upper hand physically. My best chance was to trip him over. With any luck, momentum would propel him into the wall behind me. To do that, I needed to encourage him to come toward me at a run. I picked up my skirts and darted to my left. With a twisted grin, he came after me. I ran a little, looking over my shoulder. When he was almost upon me, I dashed to the side and thrust out my foot. He fell over, but didn't hit the wall. I didn't wait to see if he recovered. I ran out through the arch and turned left, then right, where I pressed my back to a wall and gasped as much air into my lungs as I could. A moment later, running footsteps approached. I got my foot ready again, but it was Mr. Glass. He held the butcher's knife. Without a word, he clasped my hand again, and we ran together down the street. No one followed. There were no footsteps behind us, only the sound of my breathing, not his, and the distant rumble of carriage wheels. If I'd not been holding Mr. Glass's hand, I would have run into things. The stars in my vision had turned to black spots. As it was, my shoulder bumped a wall as we rounded another corner. I stumbled, only to be caught by Mr. Glass. My head swam, and I couldn't quite see him through the black haze. I felt myself falling and landed on the pavement. Or perhaps he had lowered me. I couldn't be sure of much anymore, except that I needed to breathe, or I would pass out altogether. "Unbutton your waistcoat," Mr. Glass demanded. I tried to say, "Pardon?" but all that came out was a strangled gasp. "Unbutton your waistcoat. The dress, too." When I simply stared ahead at his blurry silhouette, hoping that I was somehow conveying my shock at his suggestion, he clicked his tongue. Strong, nimble fingers undid my waistcoat. I batted them away, but my swat was ineffective. Mr. Glass finished with my waistcoat and moved on to the line of buttons down my dress. They proved more difficult to undo quickly, and he gave up being delicate with a grunt and a tug. Buttons flew off in all directions, raining on the pavement beside me. "My apologies, Miss Steele, but if you don't breathe, you'll faint or die." He must have removed his gloves at some point, because his bare fingers skimmed the swell of my breasts above my corset. My chest tightened further. Little veins of heat spread across my skin, centering on the place where his fingers lingered. I coughed, and he set to work untying my laces. His hands spread against my ribs below my breasts, separating the stiff corset. Delicious air rushed into my body, expanding my chest like a balloon. I sucked in breath after breath until slowly the blackness retreated and the dizziness dispersed, leaving me very aware of the man crouching before me, the smooth skin of his cheeks, the warmth of his breath, the flecks of gold in eyes, which continued to watch me with earnestness, and something else I couldn't quite read. His thumb stroked my skin, close to my breast. Part of me wanted to feel his hand explore higher, to have it touch me everywhere, to feel his arms around me. The thought of our heartbeats meshing together sent mine racing all over again, but not from lack of breath this time. Those thoughts were sheer madness. Clearly I was affected from all that vigorous exercise. "Thank you, Mr. Glass." A whisper was all I could manage. He blinked rapidly, then removed his hands. Cool air rushed in to replace his warmth, but I could still feel the impression his hands had made on my skin. "Are you well enough to continue?" "I won't faint, although I need to fix my attire." I quickly tied my laces, suddenly grateful he'd only parted my corset enough to allow me to breathe and not to display my breasts. His hands on my body was ungentlemanly enough. Of course. He collected the buttons and my reticule, which I must have dropped at some point. "I do apologize for—" He cleared his throat. "For everything." "It's quite all right. But if I hear you mention this to anyone, I'll not only deny it, I will castrate you in the night while you sleep." He laughed softly. "There's no need to go to such extremes. I would have given my word." I wasn't sure if the word of an outlaw was worth very much, but kept the quip to myself. He'd saved me, after all. He tipped my buttons into my reticule as I arranged my jacket over my undone dress as best as I could. I looked up to see him patting his pocket. When he saw me looking, he stopped and gathered up his gloves and the butcher's knife. He held out his hand to me, and we stood together. He quickly turned his head away and touched his fingers to his temples, but not before I saw how pale he'd gone. "Are you all right, Mr. Glass?" I asked. "Did you overdo it too?" "I'm fine, don't fuss." "I hardly call a little inquiry into your health fussing, particularly when you look peaky." He huffed loudly. "I'm fine. Let's go. We should move quickly." He handed me the reticule and tucked the knife into the waistband of his trousers. "But there's no need to run. I think we're closer to my house than we are to Cyclops and Marble Arch, so we'll head there." "Do you know where Park Street is from here?" I asked. "I do." "You've been down these streets before?" Since we were still among mews, stables, and the businesses that serviced horses and carriages, I was doubtful. Not too many gentlemen would bother to come back here. "My sense of direction is excellent. We need to go this way." Since I didn't know Mayfair too well, I let him lead the way. He was still pale, except for the dark circles that had appeared beneath his eyes. He'd seemed well enough only a short time ago, so I didn't think our encounter with the butcher caused it. Rather, he looked as if he hadn't slept properly in days. "Did you scare those fellows away after you took the butcher's knife?" I asked, looking behind us. There were no sounds of anyone following. After a few steps, he said, "They were in no condition to follow us." I gasped. "You hurt them?" He looked at me sideways. "Does it matter?" I don't know. They were just law-abiding innocent men trying to stop someone they thought was a thief. And there were 3 of them, and only 1 of him. How had he beaten them?" "They were vigilantes," he said. "Their kind of justice is never innocent and is rarely law-abiding. Perhaps in your country." He walked on a pace, and I thought the conversation ended when he said, "They would have had their sport with you, Miss Steele, before they handed you over to the authorities." "How'd you know that?" But even as I said it, I knew he was right. I'd seen it in the eyes of the man who'd approached me. I shivered and folded my arms over my chest. "Thank you again for helping me escape." "There's no need to thank me." "There is. I'm also sorry you got involved." "If it wasn't for me, you wouldn't have been there in the first place. It's as much my fault." His logic was a little broken, since he couldn't have known the reception I'd get. I still don't understand why Mr. Abercrombie would do such a thing. Why accuse me of stealing? "That's what I'd like to know," he muttered so quietly that I almost didn't hear. I haven't seen him in years, and the whole guild saga resolved itself in his favour. I ought to be the angry one, not him. "You'll have to explain this guild system to me at home. It's not the first time you've mentioned it." We entered Park Street and checked up and down the street before advancing. "Thank goodness you're not known here," I said, "or the police would be knocking on your door by now." I was safe while I resided with Mr. Glass and kept away from Oxford Street. But once our business was concluded, I would need to be careful. While the Masons wouldn't believe Abercrombie if he told them I stole, I didn't want to involve them if I could help it. I hope Mr. Abercrombie doesn't get it into his head to search for me and continue with the ridiculous accusation of theft. "I'll take care of Abercrombie," Mr. Glass said. "Take care of him? How?" "Leave it to me." Did he mean to harm Abercrombie or threaten him, Wild West style? I didn't get a chance to ask again. We'd reached number 16. a red and cream brick townhouse that stretched up to the grey sky. I peered over the black iron fence running alongside the steps down to the service entrance. The blinds were down and no light rimmed them. It mustn't be the charwoman's day. Mr. Glass's knock on the main door was answered by a footman or butler. I couldn't tell which because only his head appeared round the door, as if he were hiding the rest of himself. "It's only you," the man said, opening the door wider. "Just as well I ain't dressed proper yet." "Why not?" Mr. Glass said. "It's almost midday. What if we'd had callers?" "We ain't, but we might have." He stepped aside to allow me to pass. The man, who wore trousers, a shirt and waistcoat only, straightened to his full height. He was only a little taller than me, with a blocky build, square face and a crooked nose. His two small eyes sparkled like sapphires as they scanned me from head to toe. I felt very conspicuous with my unbuttoned dress beneath my waistcoat. "Is that her?" he asked in an accent similar to Cyclops. "This is Miss Steele, yes. Miss Steele, this is Duke, my butler, or footman." "Both?" I said, smiling. "Pleased to meet you, Mr. Duke. Is that a first name, last, or title?" "It's just Duke," he grunted. "Why'd you bring her back here?" Mr. Glass pushed past him. "Butlers and footmen don't ask questions." Duke gave another grunt and eyed me from beneath a ponderous brow. "Miss Steele will be staying here until her work with me is complete." "But—" "Shh. It's not up for discussion." Mr. Glass rounded on him. "Is that understood? Not a word." Duke's lips pressed together, but only for a second. "You look dog-tired, sir." He glanced at me again, focusing on my chest. I hadn't laced myself tightly, and my gown was still undone beneath my waistcoat. He must know. "You were supposed to inquire about the watchmaker, not frolic with the lady who's supposed to be helping you." "Duke!" Mr. Glass snapped. "I said frolic, not Duke!" Duke chuckled. I did my best to look shocked, but it was difficult to keep a straight face. Mr. Glass looked terribly embarrassed, and I'd never witnessed a servant speak so insolently to his master. I didn't think his behaviour could be put down to being American. The more servants of Mr. Glass's I met, the more convinced I was that he wasn't truly their employer, but merely acting a role. Perhaps he was their gang leader. That thought wiped the smile off my face. I swallowed heavily and folded my arms over my chest again. I was beginning to have serious doubts about staying in the house. It had been one thing to sleep under the same roof as Mr. Glass, knowing that Cyclops probably slept in the stables, but quite another knowing this ruffian wouldn't be far away from my bedroom either. "You've offended Miss Steele," Mr. Glass said to Duke. "Apologise." When Duke hesitated, Mr. Glass whipped out the butcher's knife. I swallowed my scream and covered my mouth with my hands. Duke merely grunted. "Apologies, miss. It was just a joke." Mr. Glass tossed the knife to his man. Duke caught it easily by the handle. "That might come in handy in the kitchen," Mr. Glass said. Duke inspected the blade. "There's blood on it?" "Not mine nor Miss Steele's." "Only you would go out to make simple inquiries and come back with a knife as big as my forearm?" He studied Mr. Glass's face closely, then glanced at the long case clock. "You look tired, and it ain't quite time to—" "Time to what?" I asked. "Nothing," they both said. "Go and fetch Cyclops," Mr. Glass directed his man. "He's waiting for us at Marble Arch." Duke looked like he would protest, but thought better of it. He plucked a hat off the hat stand, then moved past us to the front door. "When you get back, prepare a room for Miss Steele," Mr. Glass said. "And be sure to dress properly. From now on, we have a guest." "Aye, aye, sir," Duke saluted. Will there be anything else? Tea, cake, and a watchmaker to go with them? Lunch, and stop being an ass. Where's Willie? Willie? There were more ruffian servants, God help me. Out, Duke said. Don't know where. He nodded at the clock. You better go rest. I'll see the Cyclops in the room. It was the most sincere he'd sounded since we walked in, like he was genuinely concerned about Mr. Glass getting rest. He must be ill, or exertion wouldn't have done this to him. He looked even paler now, and the shadows under his eyes stood out in bas relief. Creases had appeared across his forehead and around his mouth, where before there'd been none. You do look very poorly, I said to him as Duke left. Please, go and rest. I'll wait in the, I glanced in the door leading off from the entrance hall. Drawing room. He gave me a grim smile and indicated the room. I'll be with you in a few minutes. Make yourself at home, since it will be for the near future. I made my way to the drawing room, but stopped inside the door. He headed up the stairs, his gait laborious, his head bowed. Once he was out of sight, I followed quietly, looking out for other servants. Mr. Glass stopped at the top of the landing. He seemed out of breath, as if that brief climb had exhausted him. Yet he'd hardly looked like he'd raised a sweat immediately after attacking 3 thugs. What sort of illness had a delayed onset? It was all very odd, but it was none of my affair and had nothing to do with my reason for following him. I wanted to find out where his private rooms were located so that I could return another time and look through them for evidence of his occupation in America and his reason for coming to England. There was no better time. He was too ill to notice me, and the servants were gone. I peeked around the corner on the 3rd level and had to dart back quickly. He'd stopped near the end, with his hand pressed against a door and his head lowered. The 3 flights of stairs had done him in. When I looked again, I expected to see him gone, having entered. But he was sitting on the floor, his legs stretched out before him, his back to the wall. He held a glowing object in the palm of his hand, and a chain dangled from his fingers. It was like he held a small sun, and its rays infused his hand with purple light. The light spread along the veins and up into his sleeve, as I'd seen it do in the carriage the day before. I continued to watch, both fascinated and terrified by the strange phenomenon. Mr. Glass seemed to know what he was doing. He showed no fear. Indeed, he seemed to bask in the object's rays and grow more healthy by the second. Suddenly his chest expanded as he took a huge gasp of air, and the colour in his face returned. It no longer looked bloodless, but full of life, as the bright glow crept out of his collar and up his neck, to his chin, cheeks, and finally his forehead. His face and hands, perhaps his entire body, was a map of fiery, glowing veins. With another deep breath, he snapped the lid of the object closed, extinguishing the light. He held it up by its chain, then tucked it into his inside pocket. Even from a distance, I could see it was an ordinary silver watch. No, not ordinary. It might look like a simple watch, but there was nothing ordinary about that glow. Mr. Glass stood and disappeared into the room. He hadn't seen me, thank goodness. I wasn't ready to face him over this secret. For it had to be a secret, or why not tell me about it in the first place, since it was most likely also linked to the watchmaker he wanted help finding. "Who are you?" The harsh female voice coming from behind me made me jump. My heart almost burst out of my chest. I went to turn to face her, but she grabbed both my elbows and jerked me back against her body. She smelled like tobacco and lilacs, an odd combination to say the least. "And why are you spying?"